History as it happens, August 9th, 2022. New World Order.
The day of the dictator is over.
The invasion by 100,000 Iraqi troops backed by air cover and tanks was brutally efficient. Iraq wants control of Kuwait's territory.
Our objectives are clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait.
We're going to go now to Mogadishu, Somalia, where there is a news story.
18 troops killed. Some of their bodies dragged through the streets of Mogadishu.
We've already withdrawn some 20,000 troops, and more than that number have replaced them from over 24 other nations. Now we will intensify efforts to have other countries deploy more troops to Somalia.
Iraq's behavior and intentions must change before our policies can change. Otherwise, we will allow the scorpion that bit us once to bite us again.
The flow of refugees across Rwanda's borders has now created what could be the world's worst humanitarian crisis in a generation.
We stopped an enormous humanitarian tragedy that was unfolding. We demonstrated that we had learned the lessons from Bosnia.
Our mission was clear: to strike at the network of radical groups affiliated with and funded by Osama bin Laden, perhaps the preeminent organizer and financier of international terrorism.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin
Russia
era.
has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people. Such an action is unacceptable in the 21st century.
When the Cold War gave way to the 1990s, as the Soviet Union was swept into the dustbin of history, American leaders knew the world was entering a new era, and they hoped to uphold a new order. Some say that order is on the line on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, but maybe it never really came to be the way U.S. leaders wanted. Maybe we're grasping at an illusion today. What is a world order anyway? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is not a man who came into office in any way, shape, or form looking to restructure the international system.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
September 11, 1990. President George Bush delivered a nationally televised address before a joint session of Congress a month after Iraq invaded Kuwait. He let the world know what U.S. objectives were in the Persian Gulf.
Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition.
But as the president explained, there was more at stake than Kuwait's independence. And it wasn't just about oil either, however important oil was. Iraq's invasion of a small country most Americans knew nothing about was also a test, an opportunity to define the terms of the new world emerging from the Cold War.
A new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace.
So if a new order were possible, how might we describe the older one it seemed to be replacing? The Cold War order? A bipolar order with the U.S. and its allies on one side, and the USSR and its satellite states on the other. Well, that picture hides a lot. Remember, there was a non-aligned movement led by India, Indonesia, Egypt, Ghana, and Yugoslavia. In China, the most populous nation was not part of any communist monolith. It was often at odds with the Soviet Union, even if the United States wasn't aware of that. So it is not so easy to define that era, the U.S. and capitalism versus the USSR and communism. But by the early 1990s, it did feel like the world was entering a new phase, a new world order, a post-Cold War order. But what does that really mean? Did it ever materialize? Or did the chaos of the 1990s wreck President Bush's vision for a world based on international cooperation and, of course, the spread of democracy and capitalism across Europe and beyond? Because we hear those words all the time nowadays. World order, the post-war order is at stake in Ukraine, we're often told. The rules-based order must be upheld. Secretary of State Antony Blinken uses those words all the time when talking about Russia and China.
We must defend and reform the rules-based international order, the system of laws, agreements, principles, and institutions that the world came together to build after 2 world wars, to manage relations between states, to prevent conflict, to uphold the rights of all people.
Blinken has said the way China wants to do business is at odds with the rules of the world order built by the United States, the one that is also said to be in jeopardy in Eastern Europe on the battlefields of Ukraine.
Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have sustained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. China is also integral to the global economy and to our ability to solve challenges from climate to COVID. Put simply, the United States and China have to deal with each other for the foreseeable future.
So when we're talking about world order, we're not dealing with an abstraction. It exists in writing, and the U.S. power behind it is quite real.
Its founding documents include the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enshrine concepts like self-determination, sovereignty, the peaceful settlement of disputes. These are not Western constructs. They are reflections of the world's shared aspirations. In the decades since, despite daunting challenges and despite the gap between our ideals and some of the results we've achieved, the countries of the world have avoided another world war, an armed conflict between nuclear powers. We built a global economy that lifted billions of people out of poverty. We've advanced human rights as never before.
Now, you heard what Blinken was saying there. That has been repeated 1 million times by American and Western officials over the decades. And that is, during the Cold War, the U.S. and NATO protected freedom and capitalism by containing Soviet communism. After the Cold War, things got messy, but the world has become a better place because U.S. leadership has plugged the dam holding back chaos, so the argument goes. Now, that worldview overlooks the fact the U.S. trampled on the principles of national sovereignty and human rights by using the CIA to topple regimes all over the world, installing or protecting vicious dictators. And there are plenty of hot wars, too. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq twice, Afghanistan. Shall we count the repetitions? And the Soviet Union had an awful record in that area, too, as has Russia since 1991. So what do we mean by world order? What did President Bush mean in 1990 when he said a new world order was possible? Does it exist any longer? Jeffrey Engel is founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is a regular guest on History as It Happens. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back, my friend.
Martin, always good to talk to you.
Well, you know, you've been on the podcast at least a half dozen times, all because several years ago when I was wandering around the now closed Amazon bookstore in Georgetown, I spotted When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War, there on the shelf. And I said, you know, I'm going to read this book. Most of the history books I've read are about events that happened long before I was alive, but enough time has indeed passed for historians to begin assessing and reassessing the end of the Cold War. I'm not going to say it's only 30 years, it's 30 years.
It's actually amazing to think about because I'm with you. I remember some of these events, but the really fascinating part about doing research in this period is that you can talk to people who were active participants in those events who clearly remember things wrong. And when you can show them the documents, and it's a really good example of how human cognition creates a story that we like to believe after enough tellings. And it doesn't matter what evidence you show somebody, oftentimes they will say, nope, I know I wrote that, but that's not what I wrote.
Well, human memory is notoriously unreliable. That's why we need historians. So yes, you're a regular guest here. You're also a listener, so you've been keyed into this ongoing conversation I've been having about the world since 1990, basically. The post-Cold War order and the ways in which the war in Ukraine are upending what is left of it or what we conceive it to be. So how about we begin in 1990? September 11, 1990, President Bush addresses a joint session of Congress about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. He says,
and we stand today at a unique and extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace.
I think the most important word in that excerpt was cooperation. The end of the Cold War, the end of competition between rival blocs, could trigger an era of international cooperation to tackle problems. What do you say about that?
I think cooperation is clearly key, but I actually think the more important words are the fact that Bush doesn't say we're going to be free and he doesn't say we're going to be strong. He says we're going to be freer and stronger. That is to say, the cooperation that you picked up on is going to be part of an ongoing process, that this is essentially history unfolding. This is, yes, the era of Francis Fukuyama and the democratic victory, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it really demonstrates that Bush, who is a very reluctant global architect, this is not a man who came into office in any way, shape, or form looking to restructure the international system. He's no Napoleon. He's no Woodrow Wilson in that regard. He's not even a Franklin Roosevelt in that regard. He is not drawn to this. He feels the opportunity thrust upon him as the leader of the country, that America has an opportunity to lead this new world order. And it's only because of American strength that it's possible. So essentially, it's a moment in history that he reluctantly embraces, which I think is actually really important to understand the way in which he structured the idea of a world getting better.
Yes, putting some of the problems of the 20th century behind them, but he was not naive in that regard. He knew there would still be problems, but there needed to be a mechanism to deal with them that had been better than the previous ones.
Yeah, and one of the key things to remember about the New World Order, and I can't stress this enough, is that it's not new. And Bush never intended it to be new. The speechwriters come up with the term New World Order, and it's not original to them, obviously.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, but go ahead.
Bush and those around him were very clear that what they wanted to do was finally implement the world that they'd been promised in their youth by Franklin Roosevelt and others. Remember, George Bush is a World War II naval aviator, had seen friends die, had been in combat, and all for the point of making a safer world with a United Nations that actually worked. The rationale behind the New World Order is that the Cold War got in the way of that vision in 1946. So the new part is that we finally get to implement that thing that's sort of been sitting there in the closet or in the background, the elephant in the room, if you will, of the international system for the last 40-odd years. Finally, we get to unwrap it.
Because words like that don't wind up in a speech of this import by accident. And he says New Order or New World Order several times in the speech. People can look up the text online or even go to C-SPAN's website and search for the speech. Took place on September 11th, 1990. How about that for a coincidence?
I tell you, someday I want to do a history of September 11th because the number of things in history that have happened on September 11th are astounding.
So clearly he sees one world order is giving way to a new one, the old one being the Cold War. It was winding down. The Soviet Union is still going to hang on for a little bit longer, but the Cold War tensions had been de-escalated. No better evidence than that, than the fact that Bush references in this speech a joint communique with Gorbachev about Iraq.
He and other leaders from Europe, the Gulf, and around the world understand that how we manage this crisis today could shape the future for generations to come.
Gorbachev was willing to allow the U.S. and the West to confront Saddam, whereas previous to that, the Soviet Union wouldn't have allowed that.
No, in fact, James Baker, who was, of course, Bush's Secretary of State, he always contended that the single moment that he realized the Cold War was over was when he was standing next to the Russian foreign minister the day after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Soviet foreign minister. And there he was next to the Soviet foreign minister. And the idea that these two antagonistic superpowers would be jointly condemning the invasion told him that the world had changed in ways that he had never possibly imagined even just a few months before.
So Bush doesn't really define what the New World Order is going to be like, and that wasn't a deliberate obfuscation. No one could say for sure what the new world was going to look like, but Bush made clear that a new order was emerging.
Well, I think he actually really does define it, because one of the things about Bush is that he was not a philosophical thinker. And he said this time and time again, that he was not somebody who was going to ponder Socrates, he said, when he would make his decisions. And the words he used are genuinely what he believed, and they're simplistic words in many ways. And I harken back, for example, to his inauguration. He said, talking also about the fact that the world seems to be opening up, and he's talking about the democratic movements. He says, we know what works. freedom works.
We know what's right. Freedom is right. We know how to secure a more just and prosperous life for man on earth through free markets, free speech, free elections, and the exercise of free will unhampered by the state.
And he's very clear that this is the wave of the future. And what's fascinating to me about him is that he's not particularly interested in imposing that wave. He doesn't want to drown anyone around the world, to abuse the metaphor, in the democratic wave. He expects that in time, everyone will see the logical, obvious benefits of jumping in. Yes, he's dealing with the Soviet Union, which of course he does not want to go away at this point. That's actually a real problem for the Bush administration, because the chaos that will ensue when mega state collapses.
That's right. There's a difference between the end of communism as an economic system and the end of the Soviet state.
Exactly, and not least of which is who controls the nuclear weapons. Bush is looking at the Soviet Union slowly, fitfully, painfully turning towards a more democratic order. And he also has the counterexample on the other side of the world of China, which in his interpretation had moved towards democracy in 1989 as well, had moved towards democracy first, obviously, under Deng Xiaoping, and then with more and more reforms that ultimately instigated and led to the student-led pro-democracy movement we refer to as the Tiananmen Square movement. And of course, he had seen it be crushed. So his interpretation of this was that, yes, I see everywhere I look around the world, people are yearning for and striving for and moving towards democracy, but it's not going to be universally accepted all at the same time.
I was going to ask if spreading democracy was part of the New World Order.
It is, but it's spreading it as an example. Woodrow Wilson, I would argue, when he first came into office, talked about America being an example to the world, that we do not want to instruct the world. We want to be an exemplar. I think he moves away from that. World War I obviously changes his thinking. And I think Bush comes into it in the same mode, which is to say, we are winning everywhere we look. I mean, it's hard for Americans today in a period where we're politically divided. Our country has suffered strategic retreats and defeats over the last 20 years. And it's a painful moment, I think, for most Americans. I think last I saw, 85% of Americans today think the country is heading in the wrong direction.
Much different mood in 1990.
Oh my goodness, everything's coming up roses. The most dominant military in the world. We just demonstrated that in Iraq, 1990, 91. President of the United States has no peer. People go to Hollywood movies. People watch our television. People want our democracy. And around the world, Americans are cheered and celebrated in a way that I think it's hard for people today to even fathom.
I want to return to the state of the world in 1991 in a little bit as we discuss the deterioration of this New World Order before it even had a chance to really be established. So in Bush, I see both a triumphalist and a pragmatist. Do you agree with that? And I say that because he was willing to, say, let democracy run its own course in some parts of the world, right? He didn't want to foist it upon people. But at the same time, he wasn't willing to let Europe go its own way when it came to security. He wanted NATO to stay and grow.
This is part of his pragmatism. So the pragmatism is indisputable. That is actually perhaps one of the better words. Prudent, obviously, is the word that's best described.
He liked that word.
Well, he liked it. And frankly, Dana Carvey ruined it for the rest of us because it's actually the best word you can possibly use. And now you have to snicker when you hear prudent.
And none of us want war in that whole area out over there. But as Commander-in-Chief, I am ever cognizant of my authority to launch a full-scale orgy of death there on the desert sand.
He's not a triumphalist in the sense that he works really, really hard, consciously so, not to celebrate too much America's victories. When the Berlin Wall falls, for example, unexpectedly, obviously, in November of 1989, he turns to his advisors first and says, I don't know what I want to say, so I'm not going to say anything. He has to be prompted and pushed to say something finally by Marlin Fitzwater, his press secretary, with the admonition that the Democratic leaders in Congress have just claimed it from the floor of the Congress as a Democratic victory for their party. So Bush goes out and essentially doesn't say anything because, as he tells his advisors, I don't want to stick my finger in Gorbachev's eye.
It seems to me that it's certainly a loosening up in terms of travel. It concurs with the Helsinki Final Act.
and it is a very good development. Our objective is Europe whole and free. And is it a step towards that? I would say yes.
If I stand up and say, as by the way, you can easily imagine subsequent presidents doing, if I stand up and say, we won, you lost, suck it, communists, that's really going to encourage the coup against Gorbachev that everyone expects. When we think about this period, we have to remember that Bush, in his first weeks in office, receives a memo that says Gorbachev has a lot of enemies, and we expect there's going to be a coup against him from hawkish conservatives, hardliners, true believers, troglodytes, if you will. And then Bush essentially receives that same memo every week for the next 2.5 years until it finally occurs in 1991. So everything he does in the context of dealing with the fall of communism is a cautionary tale from his perspective of how not to push too hard so that the good wave that is moving democratically across the Soviet Union doesn't get pushed back.
I sense more triumphalism in his speech on December 25th, 1991, when the Soviet Union is finally gone.
It's a victory for the moral force of our values. Every American can take pride in this victory.
We won the Cold War rather than a rotten, sclerotic Soviet system collapsed on its own reforms.
And that's exactly right. It's easy to say that by December 25th because the Soviet Union ceases to exist. If he's getting that memo every week saying, be careful what you say, because you don't want to rile up the antagonists, the same kind of antagonists who cracked down at Tiananmen Square, their moral equivalent, their political equivalent in the Soviet Union, you don't want to rile them up because there'll perhaps be a coup and Gorbachev will be in trouble. Well, guess what? That coup happens in August. Yeah. By December, the Soviet Union is dismantled. And so Bush can join with Boris Yeltsin and other post-Soviet leaders in saying the Soviet Union is no more. Let's celebrate that, because Boris Yeltsin is celebrating that at that particular moment. Now, obviously, subsequent Russian leaders, our good friend Vladimir Putin especially, will come to rue the day that the Soviet Union went away. But in that moment, everyone that Bush was concerned with was essentially on the same page, believing that the Soviet and communist collapse was a victory for all of our values, not just American values, that we were the chief exponent and proponent of them, but that this was a victory for everyone.
Well, in that 1990 speech, some of the rhetoric can sound a bit idealistic, but I got to tell you, Bush wasn't even that convincing in some of that oratory. As you said in your book, When the World Seemed New, reading from your conclusion here, Bush's New World Order never promised permanent peace. Neither did it bestow upon American leaders omniscience to match their preponderance of power. It offered instead a mechanism for reaffirming peace and stability again and again internationally, but with American leadership more than dictates. As ensuing generations faced the unseen and unpredictable challenges Bush never felt capable of naming. So he never felt capable of naming them.
Let's just take a step back for a second. Remember, as I mentioned before, Bush is not an original thinker. He is not an architect. At no point in his time, he actually says when he announces his run for president in the late 80s, after years of vice president, he says, I'm not a reformer. I'm not changing things. I make things better.
I will keep America moving forward, always forward, for a better America, for an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light. This is my mission, and I will complete it.
Think back, for example, to his time at the head of the CIA. He's brought in when the CIA is in the dumps and is being dumped on by Congress for illegalities that had come to light. And Bush comes in and doesn't say we're going to make massive reforms. He's there to sort of coalesce the organization and keep it whole till we figure out what to do. All of which is to say, Bush, time and time again, in his telephone calls with foreign leaders, and in particular with his diary, and it's marvelous that we have his actual diary from his time in the White House now. In his diary, he says time and again, I don't know who the enemy is in the future. And we have always had an enemy, and we always will have an enemy, at least intellectually. And this is something you can criticize him for, I think, as well. So he says time and again, the enemy is uncertainty. The enemy is anxiety. I don't know what's coming around the corner. And this is why, for example, perhaps most important example, he insists, as part of the breakup of the communist order and in the negotiations for the reunification of Germany, his single point that he insists upon with Helmut Kohl, the German leader in charge, was that Germany remained united in NATO. Why? Because if Germany remained united in NATO, NATO would survive. And without NATO, why is the United States in Europe? And we don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know what's coming around the corner, but we know that we want ourselves there to keep the Europeans from going at it again and again and again.
Twice in the first half of this century, Europe was the scene of world war, and twice Americans fought in Europe for the sake of peace and freedom. Today, Europe is enjoying a period of unparalleled prosperity and an uninterrupted peace, longer than it is known in the modern age, and NATO has made the difference.
Do you want to do another 30-minute NATO enlargement debate here or no? No, we've already done that. So back to the issue of to what extent was spreading democracy part or supposed to be part of the New World Order, as of course the United States viewed it at that time. There are other parts of the world that we may want to discuss later on where there are literally billions of people living who may not see what was happening in Europe the same way. But anyway.
I think there's actually a really easy way. There's a natural experiment occurred, thankfully for historians, and a really easy way to understand Bush's sense of democracy expanding versus subsequent administrations who wanted to expand democracy. That is to say, his son's approach to this problem is fundamentally different, in my opinion. They had the same values in the sense of they both would say things like, we value freedom, we value democracy, we value free markets. They never really spent much time defining what they meant by that because it seemed self-evident in their minds. Yeah. Both of them wanted the same thing. The elder Bush believed the world was turning democratic. So let's not push. Keep being a good example. Keep showing everyone around the world why they're going to be better off in their own self-interest for turning democratic. George W. Bush believed he needed to catalyze the process, believed that the United States needed to speed up democratization, especially in the Middle East. Now, the big reason, of course, he would say is because of 9/11, that we couldn't wait for his dad's older style to work. We couldn't wait for history to unfold in its own pace. We needed to speed up the pace. Between the two, you really see a dramatic difference in sharing the same value and believing democracy, but a fundamentally different way in trying to achieve it.
To say the least. We'll return to W a little bit later on. So I was going to ask you about this issue of democracy and I guess the role of ideology in the New World Order. Because to return to the 1990 speech, right, he is framing Iraq's invasion of Kuwait as the first test of this coming new order. And the world had a responsibility to rise to the occasion. It was an opportunity.
An era in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. 100 generations have searched for this elusive path to peace, while 1,000 wars raged across the span of human endeavor.
So, from your book, the most trenchant insight, or we'll call it a scholarly discovery in your book, is the initial reaction inside the Bush administration after the invasion of Kuwait. You write here, as long as Saddam kept the great Middle Eastern gas station open for business, some American analysts initially considered, did it really matter who controlled Kuwait? The fundamental U.S. interest in the security of the Persian Gulf is oil, the Pentagon's Paul Wolfowitz had opined to Defense Secretary Cheney. Those names sound familiar. In a private assessment of the Iraqi threat only a week before. Then you write, it was not sovereignty, ideology, democracy, or liberty. What mattered lay below the Earth's surface and the continued access to the energy it provided. Meaning, we'll still get the oil. It doesn't matter who controls Kuwait.
Well, so there's two ways to read this story. The fact that Bush's inner circle were confused about what to do when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Everyone had told them throughout the Arab world and the Middle East, all their analysts said, Saddam Hussein is bluffing. He's not going to do this. So everyone is taken aback and shocked. And so we should give them credit, I think, for taking some time to step back and think about the problem. So in that first hours after the invasion. In fact, in that very first National Security Council meeting.
That's right. You got the documents for that.
This was a team effort. I mean, this was a decade-long project with a bunch of students over the years, many of whom probably forgot they ever did it, and the archives and the National Archives working all together to get these things released. Every single minutes of every single national security meeting during the war have been released already, except this first one. It took about 10 years, and we got this first one, and boy, was it worth it. Because it said, as you described, people, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, and others saying, why do we care? If we only care about the oil, and that's all we care about, we don't care about the Kuwaitis. We don't even like the Kuwaitis, they say. You can imagine why that would have been embarrassing to come out after 2001. But if all we care about is the oil, what does it matter? And then they go home and they start thinking about it more and more. And Brent Scowcroft and George Bush, his national security advisor, of course, they have long discussions. Dick Cheney says, now this is in his memoir, I don't have the documentation other than his word, and we know where the administration reached its conclusion. But Dick Cheney said after that meeting, he went back to the Pentagon, closed the door at his desk, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and started taking down ideas and notes. And all of these people eventually come to the conclusion that there is, in fact, something bigger going on here. If the Cold War was still raging, then we could make a realpolitik assessment whether or not we needed Kuwait to be free. But something new is going on, and that we need to think big. And we need to see this as Bush said, the first template of what the international system is going to look like. Now, I have to stress something really, really, really important. Just because Bush and those around him believe, and I think they really do believe this, believe that they are setting the template for how the new world order is going to function, doesn't mean they would have reacted the same way everywhere. Kuwait matters and the Middle East matters because of oil. If one state had invaded another in a part of the world where there is no vital resource, the United States would not have moved 500,000 troops.
That's interesting because we still could have gotten oil from Saddam, right? He still needed to sell his oil to someone.
Yeah, in fact, actually, the economists at that table in the first NSC meeting said, wait a minute, just so everybody understands, this is really good for us because, we like cheap oil. And Saddam, the whole reason he invaded Kuwait was because he wanted to produce and export more oil than the Kuwaitis would allow within the OPEC framework. Mm-hmm. So Saddam was going to flood the market, if you will, drive prices down. That's good for American consumers. And by the way, good for an American president's popularity.
So the way all of this turns out makes it look like the New World Order is getting off to a rollicking start. Saddam is expelled from Kuwait. The Soviet Union collapses. Initial U.S.-Russian relations after the end of the Cold War are pretty good. The United States is sending aid to Russia. Gorbachev had talked about a common European community that the new Russia might be a part of. But the initial tests of this new world order didn't show it to be hollow, but it did expose a problem. That it wouldn't function without the U.S. in the lead. And this observation does give me pause because, as you know, I am a critic of U.S. overreach and American hegemony, the way the U.S. has behaved over the past 30 years. But when it came to the Balkans, the crisis in Somalia, even the aftermath of what happened in Iraq and Kuwait, it all revealed something. The New World Order wasn't going to function unless the U.S. took the lead.
Which, by the way, Bush and those around him didn't mind for a variety of reasons. First, because they had the military power. Second, the United States is the dominant economic power at this time, way, way ahead of China, a generation ahead of China. So there's no concern there that we can't afford it, if you will. There's a little bit of concern that domestically a recession is coming, but it actually winds up being an extraordinarily short-lived one, as people expected. To really understand why Bush and those around him were willing to embrace this responsibility, you have to take a big step back and understand their sense of 20th century history and European history in particular, which is to say, from their perspective, this is almost universally believed, I think, at this period in Washington. From their perspective, the main problem of Europe is that it's filled with Europeans, and they like to kill each other. And they do so every 20 years or so. And we went over and stopped them from doing it in World War I. And then we thought, job done, and went home. And guess what? We had to go back again. And after the second time, we stayed. And we stayed the most dominant power to keep the Russians out, yes, but to keep the Germans down, true. But really to keep all the Europeans away from each other's throats. if we're the biggest bully, then nobody else is going to, A, be able to attack their neighbor, or B, frankly, we gave them such a nice security umbrella that they didn't need to build up war power, if you will, against each other. And so consequently, Bush and those around him essentially take the opinion that when the United States is engaged around the world, peace largely reigns. Now, I would not tell that to the people of Vietnam, and I would not tell that to the many countries in Central America.
Controversial statement, but yeah.
But in a broad sense, there had not been a global war. There had not been a great power war. And more importantly, there had not been a war in Europe, which is, of course, what makes Yugoslavia so important going forward, that ultimately the place that American policymakers care most about, I would argue, which is Europe at this time, given that Japan is considered stable, it's actually considered a competitor economically. Given that they care most about Europe, the fact that war breaks out in Europe is a particular problem for subsequent policymakers. But frankly, the Bush administration didn't know what to do with that problem. That was a second-term problem, if you will.
And Bush was gone, of course, by January 1993. Bill Clinton is in charge. So was there a new world order? Some have argued not really. Odd Arne Westad, in his excellent book, The Cold War, A World History, writes that on the U.S. side, not so much changed on that day in December 1991, referring to the day the Soviet Union disappeared. He writes, American foreign policy rolled on unperturbed by any significant adjustments in strategic vision or political aims. The Cold War was over and the United States had won it, but most Americans still believed that they could only be safe if the world looked significantly more like their own country and if the world's governments abided by the will of the United States. And I mentioned the Balkans, Somalia. No one intervened in Rwanda. It seems like whatever New World Order Bush had hoped to create didn't really get off the ground. I just threw a lot at you there. Odd Westad's conclusion, my own thoughts.
What's interesting is that I think I agree with every sentence of what you just read from Westad, but I disagree with the ultimate conclusion, which is to say the United States didn't change its military posture. The United States stayed engaged around the world. Why? I would argue because the vital places of the world, natural resources and industry around the world, didn't move just because the Soviet Union collapsed. China is still a huge market. Europe is still our biggest trading partner. You still get resources from the Middle East, et cetera. Those things haven't changed. And so the United States stays forward deployed, as the phrase they would have used. I do think that we can dig down, and we already have, into this question of whether or not Americans only felt safe if the world looked like them. That's an overstatement. I think that Americans can feel safe if the world looks unlike them, so long as the world doesn't infringe upon them being them, which is why 9/11 is so important. I mean, think back to what Woodrow Wilson was actually saying when he said a world safe for democracy. He was saying a world in which democracies can live without fear of being attacked by other countries.
Yeah, not making undemocratic countries democracies. It was making the world safe for countries that already had long, strong democratic traditions.
Which is why 9/11 is so terrifying. You know, here we are in this democratic age, and look, the world has just came onto our shores, has just hit us. Now, this is I don't want to say hypocritical notion for Americans, because we had always enjoyed a sense of homeland security, no pun intended, that no other nation in the world has ever enjoyed. We had never been invaded since 1812. You know, we did not suffer bombs, really. There's a few bombs that were dropped in the Pacific Northwest by Japanese balloons during World War II.
That's right. I think six people died in Oregon.
And over 100,000 people died in one night in Tokyo when the United States firebombed it. So think about that comparison for a second. So when the 9/11 occurs, and we had been telling ourselves that the world will expand democratically, which means it will expand peacefully. I need to come back to that. Therefore, we are not safe behind our ocean moats. We are not safe behind our walls. And I do need to make one more small point that's critical here. And I think this is actually really important for understanding the Clinton period, which is that political scientists made a really interesting observation during this period that no two countries that were democratic had ever gone to war with each other. By the way, it's no longer true. In fact, The Economist magazine took it a step further and calculated that no two countries with a McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other, thereby sort of linking free markets and democracy. So from this develops the idea that if nations are democratic, they don't fight each other. Well, look at the logic there. If the entire world becomes democratic, then there'll be no war.
Yeah.
Now, that's idealistic in the extreme, but isn't that a nice thing to move towards?
Well, here's Westad about Clinton's approach after the Cold War. He says U.S. post-Cold War triumphalism came in two versions. One could be called the Clinton version, which, Westad argues, emphasized U.S.-style capitalist prosperity and market values on a global scale. Its lack of specific purpose in international affairs was striking, as was its lack of discipline in achieving even its economic aims. Instead of building broad and stable frameworks for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, I guess the kind of frameworks that Bush wanted, through the UN, the international monetary institutions, and long-term agreements with other great powers, in general China and Russia, the Clinton administration concentrated on its prosperity agenda. You know, there's also the problem of where to intervene. I mentioned Somalia before, which hurt Clinton. The United States got out of there after the Black Hawk Down incident. Then Rwanda. No one intervened, and there was a genocide there.
I hate to be cynical about this, but I think we also have to live in the real world. You know, if Rwanda had been full of oil, we would have intervened. Some places just matter more to us, and some lives, therefore, of the people who live there matter more to us. And nobody likes to hear that.
Well, it's a question of purpose, right? Sorry to interrupt, Jeff. It's a question of purpose. So the Soviet Union's gone. We don't have an adversary or a major adversary anymore. So what do we do with this gigantic U.S. military? Well, here was suffering in Somalia. I think it was Bush who sent in the first soldiers there. Then.
Right. And so Somalia and Rwanda are sort of bookends here in the sense that Bush sends troops into Somalia to aid an already present United Nations mission. Remember, he likes the United Nations. He likes that New World Order idea of using international frameworks to help people. He wants the United States to help provide greater security for the mission of getting food to people. That doesn't sound like a bad thing. And obviously, it goes terribly wrong. And I don't blame the Clinton administration. I don't know enough, frankly, about the details to blame anyone in this situation. I'm observing that it goes terribly wrong from the American perspective. We have the Black Hawk Down incident. We have fighting in Mogadishu that's much more intense than anybody in the military wanted. And Clinton makes the not unreasonable political decision to pull out.
All American troops will be out of Somalia no later than March the 31st, except for a few hundred support personnel in non-combat roles. If we take these steps, if we take the time to do the job right, I am convinced we will have lived up to the responsibilities of American leadership in the world, and we will have proved that we are committed to addressing the new problems of a new era.
Rwanda comes next, and Clinton says, last time we went in to try to solve a problem in Africa, we got sucked in and Americans died. And Rwanda occurs, and even though that was a horrible ethnic cleansing and a genocide, if it had happened before Somalia, I think we would have had a much better chance of going in.
Maybe there was just too much optimism in the early 1990s. In regard to Russia especially. There really can't be a world order without Russia. Now, you argue in your book, and you've mentioned this on our podcast many times, he can't blame the West for Russia not integrating into the West. Russia made decisions, Russian leaders. And by the end of that decade, we have Putin in power. And a war in Chechnya, another war in Chechnya. There really can't be a world order without Russia, though.
I think that's true. And same thing with China. One way to understand, and
especially now with China, right? Cooperation.
Well, before we critique the optimism of the period, which I agree with you on, we should at least stop to pause and recognize that it was so universal. Now, yes, there were people who now pound their chests and talk about how proud they are of themselves. John Mearsheimer, for example, at the University of Chicago, who said great power politics aren't going away. Well, I don't think Bush and those around him thought great power politics were going away. They thought things were going to get better. And think about the ways in which we understand the 1990s. This is the era of globalization. This is when Thomas Friedman told us that the world was going to be flat, that markets were going to level, not just, and I don't mean level destroy, I mean make level, make equal, if you will.
Even out.
Even out prosperity, even out production, and ultimately even out political stability, because the logic is a country that is economically prosperous, its people having achieved economic prosperity will want more and more and more personal liberty. So democracy will follow globalization in a flattened world. And the United States would be obviously at the center of that hub. This was a universally accepted idea, almost in the same way. And this is particularly painful for us today in 2022, to remember how the internet was universally embraced. Yes, you can find a few critics here and there, so I guess not universally embraced, 99.8% embraced as a wonderful democratizing tool think about the idea that everybody was going to be able to have access to all the information in the world at the same time. Nobody would ever make bad decisions again because of misinformation.
That's right. No one would use this new tool to make millions of dollars spreading lies to destroy someone else's life, right?
So I hate to be the professor in the back of the room for a second, but what that tells me is if everyone in the world believes something and it proved wrong, you and I need to sit down and figure out what is it that you and I think is so obviously true today we don't need to argue about it.
Yeah.
Because that's in 20 years what they're going to make fun of us for.
So about Russia, Philip Zelikow in Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, in an essay titled The Hollow Order, he writes that amid the awful economic turmoil that accompanied the end of communism, the U.S., Europe, the International Monetary Fund, and World Bank offered Russia alone more than $50 billion in financial assistance between 1992 and 94. He says those financial settlements of the early 90s did much to build a better world, and they lasted for a generation. But from the start, he says, they also bred complacency. So there was too much optimism, and Philip Zelikow would say, too much complacency. Beginning during that decade, NATO allies mostly disarmed and looked to the U.S. for military defense that no longer seemed that necessary. And the U.S., for its part, was withdrawing most of its forces from Europe and only reluctantly led a peacemaking mission in the Balkans. Here's the final sentence I'll relate from his essay. That modest success was followed by years of indifference, drift, and growing hubris, interrupted by the riveting, distracting shock of September 11th. So let's return to 9/11 now, because you raised a couple of points about it earlier. In retrospect, and it would have been impossible to say this politically in the moment, 9/11, as horrendous as it was not a national emergency or an ongoing national emergency. It did not require the United States to declare a global war on inaction, terrorism, and go on a rampage, when in fact it was a small group of fanatics who wrought all that destruction in our country. Military interventionism was not the right way of solving that problem.
I mostly agree. I think after 9/11, international jihadism, terrorism, whatever we want to call it, was an ongoing problem. It couldn't be ignored.
No, but has to be managed and not by invading other countries.
Well, that's for sure. In retrospect, and again, I did not say this at the time. I suspect you didn't say this at the time. Both of us need to call foul on ourselves.
Of course.
In retrospect, the United States reacted far too vigorously.
When, the towers are coming down and thousands of people are being killed, but we have some time now to look back on it.
We started the conversation in some ways talking about how you and I lived through this period and how our own memories can offer interesting reflections. So I'll just tell you my story of this. I distinctly remember not disagreeing with the president after September 11th, that of course we needed to have a military response in Afghanistan. Other options were too slow. If we want to use the FBI and the State Department as our leads instead of the Pentagon and the CIA, that's cute and that's too slow.
Yeah, so something is going on in the world. We've been asleep and now we need to react to it.
However, I also distinctly remember, and I think this is actually worth unpacking, I distinctly remember that that was not the case in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. And what was amazing to me in retrospect, and I'm going to throw all of my mentors and elders under the bus here, is sitting in the back of the room with some of my colleagues. This is when I was doing a postdoc in security studies, sitting in the back of my room, and as they were pumping up the enthusiasm for invading Iraq, historians who we otherwise respected talking about how, really, it's going to be great to stick it to the French once we take over Iraq and find the WMDs. Boy, this is going to recreate the world in a way that no one's going to mess with us ever again. And this is going to be easy. And they're going to greet us as liberators. And I remember sitting in the back of the room, and everyone of my age, let's say people with no actual jobs or experience, looked at this and said, how can these people be so dumb? This is going to end poorly. We all know this is going to end poorly. We all know this is going to be a quagmire. We know this is going to be another Vietnam, whatever term you want to use. And so what is fascinating to me about that is why people who should have known better didn't. And I think ultimately the answer is because they thought it was going to work anyway.
People will forget about the WMD when they see Iraqis becoming Jeffersonian Democrats overnight with an American flag in every window and a chicken in every pot.
Well, not only that, we had just spent the last 25 odd years post-Vietnam building up the American military's confidence and the American public's confidence in its military. And by the way, with a lot of good reason. They're remarkable people who do remarkable things.
And now we had a new purpose, defeat global jihadism.
One way to understand Iraq, Bush and those around him gave an impossible job to the military, and the military saluted and said, yes, sir, we'll do it. That's a shame.
I was behind the war at first. I did not exercise good judgment in those days. I believed what my government had been telling me.
One of the most striking moments for me of the first Gulf War in 1991 is that George H.W. Bush obviously went to Congress reluctantly to get an authorization for the use of military force, but then said internally in his own memos, in his own conversations with aides, in his own diary, that even if he lost the vote, he was going to go to war anyway. First of all, he thought he had the commander-in-chief's prerogative to do so, but more importantly, he said, we're going to win quick. And when we win quick, let's see Congress try to come back at me when my approval rating is 90%. I think the same basic logic applied to the policymakers of 2003. It genuinely never occurred to them that they might lose.
Arne Westat writing, the second form of U.S. post-Cold War triumphalism could be called the Bush version, where Clinton emphasized prosperity, Bush emphasized predominance. In between, of course, stands 9/11. It is possible that the Bush version would never have come into being if it were not for the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington carried out by Islamist fanatics, writes Westat. In fact, by a renegade faction of one of the U.S. Cold War alliances, referring to the jihadists in Afghanistan. What is clear is that the Cold War experience conditioned the response of the United States to these atrocities. Instead of a combination of targeted military strikes and global police cooperation, maybe what Bush the Elder would have called for, sounded like it in his 1990 speech, which would have been the most sensible reaction, Westat says, the Bush administration chose to use the unipolar moment to lash out at its enemies and occupy Afghanistan and Iraq. Why do we need world orders? I mentioned Philip Zelikow before. He talks about the world orders that existed prior to the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. But he says it was not until the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 that nations began purposefully organizing an ambitious order. And he said the era's peacemakers strained until 1925 to reconstruct a bitterly broken world amid the chaotic collapses of 5 dynastic empires, with the Ottoman Empire holding on the longest. Why do we need world orders? Why do powerful countries feel like they need to order the world?
You know, I was surprised when I read Professor Zelikow's article there that he said 1917 was the first time. I would have gone back to 1815. And the Congress of Vienna, a moment when, now granted, those are largely monarchies as opposed to more democratic states, I'll grant that. But at a moment when people came together and said, how can we structure the world so that calamity doesn't happen again? And I think in the same way that you buy fire insurance, in the same way that you wear a seatbelt, in the same way that you wear a bike helmet, you hope you never have to use any of those. But there are restraints that we put upon ourselves and others to try to minimize the basic human tendency to lust, to kill, and to desire.
Well, the Congress of Vienna was reactionary. And of course, we're talking about the world. We're really just talking about Europe. What do we mean when we say world order today, with Russia invading Ukraine, but China, home to what, 1.5 billion people, India, home to more than 1 billion people, are not with NATO and the United States in that?
Here's where I'm going to sound uncomfortably patriotic and jingoistic even.
No.
Uncomfortable because I don't want it to be understood in any way, shape, or form that I am an American triumphalist. We have made mistakes. We make mistakes. We have intervened in places we shouldn't. We should be more restrained. We can get better. Okay, having established that, I also think that the world order that the United States promotes is better, safer, more prosperous, and more peaceful than that promoted by other potential orderers, architects, like the Chinese or the Russians. You know, so the world order that we have projected in Europe is that you cannot go into Europe and invade your neighbor and have nothing happen.
But, you know, this world order exists only in our minds, it seems. I mean, it's a multipolar world now. Take Turkey, for instance. I already mentioned China and India's, their attitudes toward what Russia is doing right now. They're not on our side on that conflict.
Not to split hairs, but you're talking about hegemony. I don't think that the United States was, while it was militarily hegemonic, one could argue, or at least super dominant in the 1990s, I don't think the United States dictated everything to the world. We did not go inside China and tell them how to run things. We did not sufficiently, I'd argue, go inside Russia and tell them how to run things. Things might have turned out better and they would have had a better legal system, which is a foundation which they lacked, I think, for entering a more stable period. So ultimately, my point is, if you don't like the American-led order, I'll get back to the question of whether we need one or not. But if you don't like the American-led order, ask yourself, would you like the Chinese better? Would you like the Russian better?
I guess what I'm getting at, though, is, how would we define today's world order? I mean, it's not simply just the United States and Europe. If we're going to be committed to helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia's war of aggression, that has implications for other parts of the world, like Taiwan, correct? And I think Nancy Pelosi's trip there was regrettable. I don't think she should have gone. I'll share with you some insights from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a non-interventionist think tank here in Washington, written by Michael Swain. China continues to escalate its sharp response to Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, including the snap suspension of several U.S.-China dialogues. This all-too-predictable set of actions has been met by U.S. officials as an overreaction and unnecessarily provocative. They live in some kind of dream world, he writes. Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was unprecedented in many ways and clearly violated assurances that the United States had given regarding one China, capital O, capital C, at the time of Sino-U.S. normalization. That was back in the 70s with Nixon. At the time, the U.S. pledged that it would not engage in official contacts with Taiwan, would limit the type and level of officials sent to the island, and acknowledge China's view that Taiwan is part of China. I guess if I can sum up my chaotic thoughts here, Jeffrey Engel, we're trying to maintain a world order that we can't maintain, that maybe doesn't really exist outside of our own imaginations. That the world is changing and military commitments to defend Taiwan are potentially problematic insofar we can't fulfill all of our security commitments.
We're friends, so I'm going to go personal introspective here for a second.
Now, you can rip me to shreds here. I mean, that's why I have you on.
I'm sympathizing with you. I've been thinking a lot about death lately. My father just passed away. And our family is mourning, and it makes me realize I'm getting older too. And I can do 100,000 sit-ups every day and eat nothing but kale. And you know what's going to happen? Eventually I'm going to die. So we have a world order to make things better for as long as possible. That doesn't mean things are going to be perfect. It doesn't mean we're not going to get cancer. It doesn't mean we're not going to have trouble. And what terrifies me, what keeps me awake at night when I think about the international system, I've been thinking about an article that should begin something along the lines of, you have to pity historians because we know where this is leading. We know where the rising nationalism around the world leads. We know where the rising ethnic hatreds and religious tensions in the world leads. We know where great power conflict leads. We know where divided economic interests lead. Nowhere good. Mm-hmm. So the world order is designed, I think, and an American-led order in particular, to stave off chaos as much as possible. But it's unrealistic to think that we're going to avoid it entirely.
The old problems that won't go away. Maybe the best observation in Philip Zelikows' essay is that the next world order must be built on institutions that encourage global cooperation and not national interests. So, for instance, we have the war in Ukraine, right? We could have a war between China and Taiwan, with the U.S. involved in both. These new wars are not only creating new problems like hunger, or exacerbating existing problems like hunger, they're going to prevent the world from cooperating on global problems in the future. Climate change, pandemics.
I'm going to flip the script a little bit and say that I think part of your critique comes from an ongoing domestic question, vein of argument within American history about what we owe the world, how engaged we should be with the world, whether or not we should even engage the world at all. And I would argue that the last three administrations in their approach to climate change give wonderful examples of both, in the sense that what is really going to disrupt the current world order that you and I live in is climate change. That is going to cause conflicts that we can't even imagine and stresses that we can't even imagine.
That's right. Climate refugees spilling over borders. Yeah.
And I think that the Obama administration recognized climate as a national security concern for that reason, and tried its best, however fitfully, startfully, woefully inadequate, tried its best to use American prestige to lead the world somewhere better on climate. The Trump administration went in the opposite direction, abdicated international concern for climate, I would argue.
Yeah, pulled out of the WHO, too.
Well, and the Biden administration is trying to go back to leading, but you can see how complicated this is. We are taking incredible steps backwards on solving the climate problem because the United States and China are not going to talk now because of other geopolitical issues.
And Russia remains far outside the international community the way the United States might define it. Again, I'll refer to how China and India view the war in Ukraine. So yeah, right now we're not in a good place globally right now.
Again, pity the poor historian. You talk to historians every day for your job, and they all know something that the American public is unaware of, which is where all this leads.
Things can get much worse.
Right. And by the way, it's been a long time. In fact, more than the average lifespan of an American since things have been really, really bad in America. I mean, really bad. I mean, World War bad, Great Depression bad. We've had it so good, frankly, that we don't understand the consequences of going off the rails. And I think a lot of the political division that we see in our country today is as a consequence of that.
I also found out something today that I found bizarre because I consider you a pretty smart guy. You're also a New York Jets fan.
You talk about historians knowing how things are going to turn out.
We've seen this soap opera before. So you got to be a lonely Jets fan in Texas. Which might be okay.
That part's okay. What is more troubling, of course, are all the Cowboys fans.
We got a lot of them here in Washington.
We raised, 2 kids here in Texas, born here, raised here. And we say to them all the time, or at least I do, my wife knows better. I say to them all the time, you must treat everyone with dignity and respect and treat them as you wish to be treated. Unless they're a Cowboys fan.
Unless they're a Cowboys fan. There are a lot of Cowboys fans here in the Washington area because when the team used to be called the Redskins, their owner was a racist and he was the last to integrate his roster. Mm-hmm. So a lot of African Americans in this region adopted the Cowboys as their favorite team. So the Jets, we're about the same age. I'm 46. I'll be 47 soon. I mean, you remember the 1980s, the mid-1980s with Ken O'Brien and Al Toon and all those guys? Yeah.
Well, in fact, what's funny is my daughter, they were doing a throwback day she's in the color guard. And, they had Hawaiian Day one day, and then they had Western Day, and now they had throwback day. It's 105 degrees here in Texas. They're trying to take their minds off the heat. And so she said, do you have anything throwback? And I was like, well, I can give you my Vinny Testaverde jersey.
Oh.
And she said, who? It's very sad.
In 1998, that was the best Jets team with the exception of their 68 team, which was before my time. I was born in 75. So
I'm with you. I don't remember that.
It's amazing. Joe Namath was still playing football, retired in 75 or 76. He played 1 year at the Rams. It seemed like it was a century ago when I was growing up in the mid-1980s, and it only had been less than 20 years since the Jets had won a Super Bowl. Well, now it's more than 50 years since the Jets have won a Super Bowl, and I'm still waiting for one.
And you're going to keep waiting.
Yes.
What's funny is I was just on their website the other day because I was trying to get myself a new hat and shirt for the year. I swear to God, they had more Namath jerseys than anybody else.
Yeah, I do not want any more Jets jerseys because I got a Sheldon Richardson jersey a few years ago. He lasted a couple of years. I got a Sam Darnold jersey a couple of years ago.
Oh, bad choice.
Yeah, so now I only get throwback jerseys. So I got a Joe Klecko jersey.
I was about to say Klecko.
Yes,
Klecko's the one you got to get.
I have an Al Toon jersey. I'm not going to get a Ken O'Brien jersey. Anyway, the Jets had we're going to probably go on and on here, and listeners, their eyes are going to glaze over. But, had the Jets had a better quarterback in the mid-1980s, sorry if Ken O'Brien is listening to this. If they had Dan Marino, if they had drafted Marino in 83 rather than O'Brien, maybe the Jets would have won a Super Bowl in the mid-80s. But,
I wonder, and this is a good lesson for all historians and all history students, because there's always the what if. I wonder what would have happened if Pennington hadn't hurt his shoulder.
No, he gave us a pound of flesh. He was good. Well, we'll see if Zach Wilson works out. If it doesn't, would you be surprised?
I'm not putting bets.
Jeffrey Engel, author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Thank you once more for challenging my ideas, answering my questions, and even talking about the New York Jets a bit. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to return to the abortion issue and prohibitions, the problem with prohibitions. When the government tries to ban something entirely, it rarely works. We're going to speak to Michael Kazin and the comparisons between post-Dobbs America and the Prohibition era. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.